Hello everyone and welcome to class number 9 of Nuke and Digital Environments, and this class is going to be the last one where we work on the balcony shot. So what we're going to do today, first talk about a few more things that have to do with exporting plans from SpeedTree into Maya, because we want to vary a little bit what we have there, and we're lucky enough to have two plants from the SpeedTree plant library, and I'm going to talk about it in a moment. And then we're going to go into Maya, lay out the scene, finish it, then set it all up for render. So we're going to look at setting AOVs or passes, setting matte layers and matte passes, rendering it all out. Then we're going to go into Nuke and work in comp and use the passes that we created to give the final look to the balcony and the background. So as I've said, the SpeedTree guys were really generous and agreed to give us two plants from their plant library to use in this course and for you guys to use when you work on the shot. So these plants are from the commercial plant library, so they're giving us those plants on a condition that they're only going to be used for this project. So I trust you guys not to use them for anything else. This is really a gift from SpeedTree guys. So we have this, I chose two plants that could fit well in the balcony, you know, plants that would go in pots. So we have this tobacco plant and also the tropical snow. And this one actually comes with a pot that was built with it. So that's great. You can export these in Maya, and now we're going to go in Maya and look at some additional problems that these plants present when you tweak the shaders to work in Arnold. So I brought into Maya the tropical snow plant and did the usual stuff, the things we talked about last week. Took each one of these, again, I exported it as separate objects per material, and for each object go to the material and change it to AI standard, and you'll see that you have more nodes here that relate to the material. A UV chooser node, place to detexture. The texturing on these plants is a bit more complicated than what we on the plant that we did on our own, but you just have to find the general shader, which would usually be after all the texture nodes right here. And I already changed all these to the AI standard, and I put a ground plane and a general light dome just to light it. But here's the problem. You can almost see it in the viewport if you look at this sleeve, and let me just render this out. So what you see is a very obvious mismatch between the geometry and the actual texture. And this is because these textures for the leaves use opacity maps. They use an alpha, and once the alpha is used, you're not going to see this part of the geo. It's going to be cut out. But it doesn't work by default. And the main reason is that, unlike other renderers, Arnold treats every object by default as opaque. And it's a good idea to do that, because by that you already eliminate all kinds of unnecessary transparency calculations. So every object that is transparent or half transparent needs to be defined as non-opaque. So what you need to do is go and select the leaf object. So let's select this one that we're looking at, and you go to the actual node of the geo, and you go to Arnold, and what you need to uncheck is opaque. Once you do that, Arnold treats it as a transparent object. But you still have to plug in the alpha map. And the way you do it is, again, you go back to the shader, and the alpha transparency is actually enabled in the refraction. So if you open up the refraction part, here's the opacity. And this is where you want to plug your alpha map. So you go and search it. Of course, it's going to be a file. So we go to the tropical snow and we look for leaf number 2. This is leaf number 2, and what we want is the alpha. And here it is. You open it, and now if we re-render, it should work. And that's already much better. Okay, so I went ahead and selected the other type of leaf and did the same. Basically, go to the object properties, Arnold, and disable opaque, and then in the shader attach the opacity map or the alpha. And that should be good, and we can render and see, and indeed the shape is right. But you can tell that something is still wrong because these leaves look black. Looks like the texture is not really working on them. The other types of leaves look okay, and you can see that actually in the viewport. So something is wrong here. And what I do is, again, go to the actual object properties, to Arnold, and go to subdivision and change it from none to Catmull-Clark. And now it works. So yeah, here is an instance where I can't tell you why it works. I really don't know. But after experimenting a little bit with this, and it might have to do with these leaves being two-sided, I'm not sure about it. What I know is that this actually works. If we render it as a whole, let's try that. Well, it looks great now. So problem solved. If you ever see black leaves when you import a SpeedTree plant, now you know what to do. Alright, so it's time to go back to our main scene, and you can see that I incorporated the new plants into the layout. Here is our tropical snow, and here's our tobacco plant that you can export and treat the same way we did for the tropical snow. And here's another plant that I've got. And of course, you can create as many as you want. Now you can see that right here, I added the one plant where we had animation. And if I play it, you can see that it's animating, and we can see it better if we go into perspective. So here's the layout in perspective. I didn't put any pot here because we don't see it anyway, so there's no need for that. And if I select the leaves and go into the point cache, what you can see is that I time shifted the start frame to 1150 because we don't see it before that, so that we don't end up with frames that don't have animation towards the end. And it's got that animation in there. And I went a bit more exaggerated than what we did in the previous class, but in the context of the camera move and seeing it there, I think that will work fine. So we've got the scene laid out, we've got all the shaders and textures and all the lighting. Now we want to set up everything for rendering. And just because rendering takes time, I mean, that's the part of 3D that I really hate. Well, everybody does. You can definitely start by going half-res and rendering the whole thing half-res. Actually, in this class, everything I'll show you was rendered half-res. And actually, it works pretty nice in the comp. And usually when you render CG, it's almost always the same case. CG always comes up too black, too contrasty, and too sharp. When you put it into a plate, you almost always have to soften it one way or another in comp. So sometimes rendering out something not at the full resolution, but let's say it's 75% or even 50% like we do here, is not necessarily a bad thing. Anyway, so let's go and look at the render layers, and we've got our master render layer, and we've got our AO render layers that we've set before. You just have to make sure that all the new objects that you're adding are in there. You want to go and add them to this layer. So the first thing we want to do, if you remember a few classes back, we were looking at the first test renders that we did, and we noticed that when we apply the distortion, we have this little strip of stretched pixels toward the end, and that's of course usual because you're pushing in a render, so you don't have any pixel information there. So we need to overscan, and it's very easy to do in Maya. All you need to do, and I went back to the master layer, select your camera, attribute editor, and you can change either the pre-scale or the post-scale. It doesn't really matter, but what you want to do is push out a little bit. So let's say 0.95. That's basically 5% overscan, and that should cover that little strip for the distortion. And now all we need to do when we're back in Nuke is to compensate for that and scale it back up. Now let's talk about AOVs, or render passes. We want to include in our render all the render passes that we think we will need in comp that can help us. we can always enable everything, but sometimes it just makes the EXRs heavier and slower to render. So it's a good idea to choose what you want and know what these are. Let's go back to our, we are on the master layer, and open the render settings, and we want to go to AOVs. And the first thing we want to set up is we don't want each pass to be on a separate EXR. We want them all to be in one EXR sequence as a multi-channel EXR. So we go to default drivers right here and click on the arrow. We don't have to change this, and go to the attribute editor, and all we need to do is enable merge AOVs. And now all these AOVs are going to be merged into a single multi-channel EXR. Now let's look at the options we have here. These are the general AOVs that work for all the shaders. We don't need ID because we're going to create our own mats. The normals pass. This is something that I find very useful for relighting purposes, and I'll show you that in Nuke. So let's enable that one. The position pass, that if you do true relighting in Nuke, which we're not going to do here, we're going to use the normal as a way of cheating a bit of the light. If you are going to do true relighting in Nuke, or you really need the information of where each object is in 3D space, you want to enable the position pass. I don't think we'll need it for this shot, so let's leave that. Z-depth, we'll include it. We'll take a look at it. Again, I'm not sure we'll need it for this context. Beauty, we already have. Motion vector, we are already using motion blur in the render itself that we set a few classes ago, so no need to deal with that. Opacity, I don't think we'll need. We don't have to deal a lot with transparent objects except the leaves on these plants. These are they're handy for other things that we don't need. Let's leave them. So we're basically selected the normals pass and the Z-depth. And now let's go to AI standard, which is the shader we're using for everything we have in this scene. And we definitely want direct diffuse. We want direct specular. We want indirect diffuse, and we want indirect specular. All these could be helpful. Emission, we don't really have objects that have emission on. Reflection, again, we're not really using reflection, only as part of the spec. The same thing for refraction and subsurface scattering. Again, we're not using any of these. Here you see all your selected AOVs, and it also shows you the data type. It chooses automatically. Usually you don't need to change it. So of course normals will be vector because it's direction. Z-depth will be float because it's an infinite number. By the way, Z-depth in Arnold is never normalized. So it's never 0 to 1. It's 0 to huge numbers, and we'll see that. So you have to know how to deal with that in Nuke. And then all the lighting passes are of course RGB. Now, if you want to test in real time how one of these AOVs looks like, or just to see what it gives you, you can do it without going into batch render. You can change the render view AOV. Let's choose, let's say, the indirect specular. And now you can just do a test render, and it will render just that AOV. Okay, so here it how it looks, and this way you can test all your AOVs before you render. Let's switch this back to beauty. And this is it. Your main render layer is set up. Your AO is already set up. Now we want to set up a third layer where we create mats, because usually when you tweak things in Nuke, you'll need to have some way of separating one thing from another. You don't want to affect everything, and you have to decide what mats you want to create, how you want to divide this scene. Sometimes you only know after you work in comp, and then you realize, let's say, that you need a mat for just this spot. It's very easy to set up. What we're going to do here is set a generalized kind of mat, dividing the scene into something logical, thinking of color and lighting. And I'm thinking the floor is very sensitive because it's already very kind of blown out, and anything we do on other stuff like the plants might affect the floor in an unwanted way. So we want to have a separate mat for the floor. I'm thinking let's have a separate mat for the floor. one mat for all the non-plant stuff, so the railing and this part of the balcony, and a third one for the plants and the pots, just to give some general division. Now, there are different ways to do it. I like to use just RGB mats, meaning that in each pass I'll have, 3 mats, red, green, and blue. And so we don't need more than one pass because we basically are thinking of 3 mats. So all you need to do is create a new layer, and let's call this layer mats. And now you need to select all your geo. So let's do this and then take out the light. That's it. So we've got all the geo in there. We want to add selected object. So everything is in here now. Now we can select the floor, and we'll assign a new shader to it. And again, let's open the attribute editor, select the floor, and assign new material. And that will be, again, an AI standard, and we want to call it floor mat. And we don't care about anything here, basically. We just want to go to the mat section and enable it and choose a color. And we want to use either red, green, or blue. We have them as presets, but if you want to make sure that this is a perfect value, which it should be, you can change the display from HSV to RGB 0 to 1. And of course, it should be 1 for red, 0 for green and blue. We can go ahead and assign a green color to all this stuff and a blue color to all the plants. So I've done just that, assigned the mats for all 3, and if we render now this layer, we can see how it looks. And as you can see, it's very fast because it's all flat. There is no ray calculation. So you can render these separately. It's very easy and efficient and fast. And that's it. So now that you've got these 3 layers, I usually like to batch render each one separately. It's up to you. So I disable to select the master layer, save the scene, go to render, and just batch render. And then go ahead and do the AO and the mats. The AO and the mats are going to be much faster. The most time consuming, of course, will be the master layer. So finally, we're back in Nuke, and here's our render, the whole thing. Or actually, I rendered up until 267. It doesn't matter. The rest is kind of the same. Let's look around 120. That's a good area to see. So here's our render, and here's our AO. Of course, because we're working here 1 to 300, you can go in the actual EXR and change this to offset and put 1000 there. That will offset it back. Or you can add a time offset node. It's the same thing. So we've got these 2, and we want to probably merge them through a multiply to add some more shading in there. And again, that should be controlled when we see it in context. So that's multiplying the render, the beauty, with the AO. Not at 100%. I've got it at about 85%. Now let's just quickly look at the different passes that we've got here, and we can do this through here. So here's an alpha that comes with it. Here's the depth, and as you can see, we see nothing at all. But it doesn't mean there's no depth there. It's just not normalized. So numbers would be crazy, and we're not going to see the difference until we use a grade node. If you control scrub over, you can see in the red channel, because it's all in the red channel, these huge, like 20,000 numbers, and how they recede back to 10,000, which is the back. And this is the balcony that right close to us. So if we want to see anything in here, we can do this by adding a grade node. And we want to grade everything. And we need to take the gain way down to a number that will compare to this. We have something around the 20,000. So something like 0.00001 or something. Let's try 0.1. And suddenly you see things appear there. Now we don't have enough contrast. We can take the gamma and push it down, and then suddenly, you know, when I really crank this, you start feeling the depth. Now, why is this so hard to see? Well, we're talking about a pretty small distance from the camera to the edge of the balcony compared to the rest. Now, if you use this specifically for defocus, you can do the same thing without using a grade node, using the ZDFocus node in Nuke. If you want to use this as an alpha for something, say for hazing the background more, you really need to tweak it just like we did here. But to be honest, for this balcony shot, we have the balcony and we have the background behind, and I think if we just put slightly different levels of defocus for foreground and background, that would be good enough for us to give a sense of depth. We really don't have to go that detailed here. So we're not going to use the Z depth. I just wanted to show it to you. Here's the normal, and that's very simple. Red would be, green would be the Y, the light coming, or normals facing up, and then red and blue are normals facing the X and Z. And we might use that as a little, you know, cheap trick I use. This is the direct diffuse, and this is the direct spec, which usually is very useful in many situations. This is the indirect diffuse or the bounce light, and this is the indirect specular or the bounce reflections, and you can actually see that. Again, all these can become very handy, so you want to always have them in your render. Let's go back to RGBA, and finally here's our matte render. Very simple and very useful. Okay, so let's start by looking at the whole picture. So we want to go back to the end of our script and look at her. So it's very clear that we need to use some defocus here. If we compare this to the plate, yep, we're way too sharp. It also feels too black, too muddy. Well, it needs some comp work. So let's get started on this. So first, let's set some defocus for the background, and we should look at the plate. This is actually our cleaned up plate, so we're missing all the markers here, but that's fine. We're definitely out of focus, not a lot, but enough here. And as we turn around, by the time these guys come in, they're already in focus. Somewhere along this turn, our BG gets more into focus. So what we need to do is animate, let's say, the background. So here's our pre-rendered background from the previous classes, and I've already got a defocus here that is animated. So by the time we start doing that turn, it goes from, what was the value here, 6 to 1, just leaving a little bit of defocus till the end, so it's not totally sharp. And what you probably want to do is copy it and put this on your CG balcony, but give this slightly lower numbers, so our defocus up until the rack is 4, and then when we go in focus, that would be 0. So together, that will at least give a feeling that this area of the balcony is slightly more in focus than the back. So we've got that. Another thing we might want to do on the whole background, not just the CG, but the whole background, is that feeling of a flare. If you look at her hair, at the blacks on her hair, as she goes towards the corner, we've got some sunlight flaring happening, and that, if you remember, made our extraction a little bit harder there. So and then it's gone. And we kind of want the background to go with that. So what we can do is animate the grade node. I think it's basically just a gamma around this area. So we have it, and I raise the gamma generally just to give it a bit, you know, to make it a bit more lifted. That's without, just a little bit. I think it helps. And that becomes bigger around here, and then goes back to 1. But what I did was mask this, put a general mask kind of in the area where she walks, and let's look at the whole thing. and of course that roto is blurred a lot, so it's a soft gradient just at this point to give the around her in the background a sense of that flare, and that's turned off. And you can see what it does is kind of lift these areas in the background, not all the way, but here, just to go with her flare. And when you'll play it in real time, you'll kind of sense it. It's a small detail that will help. So now that we've got the general level of defocus, let's look at our CG and see what we can do to make it feel a bit more in there. So a general grade won't hurt. The blacks are generally too strong. It just feels a bit too black there. So if we can just give a little bit of lift, and you can see, just lifts everything, puts it a little bit more in the back. That already helps a lot. Now, the plants feel a little bit too even and a little bit too dark, especially the leaves, not so much the pots. Here's a trick I use a lot of time using the normals map. So again, we attach a shuffle node and we just select the normals from our main render. And if we look at the green channel, that's basically normals facing up. And you know, whenever you have things outdoor, everything facing up towards the sky will usually be brighter, and regardless of where the sun is, because the sky itself is you know, a huge light dome. Now this already happens in the render, but sometimes you just want to boost it a bit more. So here's what we're doing. We're selecting the green as our alpha, and we're putting a color correct node here where we gain up things. And when we add that, if you look at the plants, you see that the areas at the top of the leaves suddenly get brighter. And this will help. And it also actually helps on the balcony, but we want to do a different treatment. But it certainly doesn't help us on the floor. As I said before, the floor is already very sensitive. It's kind of overblown. So what we want to do is not have it on the floor, just the plants. So we take our mats and we select the blue where the plants are, and that's going to be our alpha. So we only have the plants, and we use a mask node to mask this green normal channel. And now basically we have just the green channel just on the plants. So in here now, when we enable this, we did not touch the floor, but we added some life and light to the plants. Another thing we might want to do, and that can also help us on the balcony edges, is take the direct spec, which gives another kind of nice sunlight kick. And this time we're going to select, we want it on the plants and the railings, but not on the floor. So instead of selecting the blue and the red, we can just use a stencil node and just select the ground as an alpha. So I have a shuffle here, shuffle node, that's selecting again just the green. So when we stencil this, we get all the highlights on the railing and the plants, but not on the floor. And we can grade this a little to be a bit warmer, and then we can just plus it or add it to our render. Let's look at the colors. So that's without, and that's with, and we can go and look at, let's say, another frame. And again, that's without, and that's with. So we're basically boosting the highlights, giving another kick. And now if we look at the whole thing, and these are small changes, but they mean a lot when you look at the whole thing. So the two things that we now did on the plants and the railing, that's without, and you see everything feels a bit kind of dull and flat, and that's with these changes. Suddenly there is life. Let's look around here. So this is with our added life, and that's without. Everything is kind of flat and darkish. Now it's giving more definition. It's also doing something nice on the edges of the pots. So sometimes, you know, as good as your render could be in the lighting, it's always a good thing to take it in comp and kind of, you know, boost things up to give it a little bit more life and match it more to the plate. Now, this transform, I forgot to mention it before. As you remember, we did an overscan So we need to compensate for this and scale it back to where it should be. And the number is this, and you calculate it very simply by dividing 1 by the number you use for the overscan. So we did 0.95, so 1 divided by 0.95 gives you 1.0526. That's just a little bit of math. And the only thing you want to make sure is that you have black outside enabled there. And then we reformat and put the distortion on. And here is another little thing I usually do on CG, not always, but it helps. So let's pick this area. What I'm doing is taking the whole thing and blurring it a little bit. What did I do? 10 here, and then using a max merge node to put it over. And what the max does is that it still preserves the very highlights, so we're not choking any highlights. What we're adding is a very subtle, and again, I'm talking about putting it at, I have it the mix at 0.3, a very subtle kind of flare. And this is something that happens in the lens usually when things are very bright. They kind of flare. It helps break out the edges a little bit of CG and give it a bit more of a realistic feeling as far as we're concerned. And again, it's a very subtle kind of tweak, but something that can add some detail or just some feeling. And you see it here happening. There are other ways to do it, but I usually like this simple method. I also usually soften everything just a touch. And soften is a great filter because you can introduce very small amounts of blur. The blur filter is by pixel and is way too heavy. Soften is sub-pixel, and you can set the amount and the size. And edge blur always helps to just blend the edges with the background. We can look at this with the background and just disable all these three, and you'll feel the difference. So first, using that bit of flaring on the edges, then the soften, almost unnoticeable because we have defocus there, and the edge blur, again, very subtle but helps. I think we'll see more if we turn off the defocus for a second. And again, you see all this noise here. That's because in my render, I did not, first of all, it's half res, but I did not set the settings for anti-aliasing and all that too high to save time. Once you're happy with everything, you should just up all these settings, not too much, of course, and re-render at full res so you'll get the final image. But if we look at it now without the defocus, that's that flaring, which always helps. Now you can feel the soften and the edge blur too, which helps kind of blend those edges. And that's it. It's starting to look pretty nice. And let's look at the whole thing in motion. So let's use our trusty hero to have you rendered part of it. I didn't render all the way through up to frame 260 something. And I reformatted to HD and rendered JPEGs. It's always easy if you just want to watch something and you don't want to do the QuickTime. Instead of rendering DPXs or EXRs, which are going to be much heavier to load and cache, you can just render JPEGs as you go. And it's starting to look very nice. From here on, I'll leave you to refine it, and I'll give you some suggestions and ideas. What I'm seeing here, I mean, it's nice to see that movement in the plant when the camera settles down, and we'll see more of it if we render a bit more. And you can feel that bit of flaring on her in the background as she passes. I would maybe exaggerate it even more, make it a bit longer on the background, the way it feels to me right now. Maybe when I re-render, I will increase the motion blur a little bit on the CG and maybe the background, just to give more of that sense of fast movement. You're definitely, you should feel free to add more stuff in the balcony. I mean, it is a balcony. There could be a chair or a table or some other smaller pots with plants or anything that you want. Another thing is the actual story of the movie. If you're thinking of working this for the actual film, the story is that she wakes up in the morning and she comes out and there is not a single person alive in the entire world or city. They're all just gone. So at that point, you want to go and look at your background and see if there's any areas where you see, and this is of course just a still image, but see if there is any area where you actually see people, like these two here. Having cars in the middle of the street is kind of fine because, you know, they just stopped. You don't see the people in them, but having a guy on a motorcycle, that gives it away. But again, you know, in the context of the whole thing, it's really hard to see that. It almost, the very fact that everything is static and no cars are moving kind of gives that idea. If you do want to add any kind of movement in the background, you can think of some steam or some smoke coming from somewhere. That could just give a little bit of movement, but you don't want too much. And her edges still need some work, especially the hair and the areas, you know, right here where we had to cut some because we had to replace the floor. And this area also needs some work, so we cut out that bit of like half transparent greenish glass piece here, but the roto still needs a little bit of refinement so we don't get this weird edge. Again, it can all be worked out. Probably add something here to fill it in more. From now on, it's up to you. We've done a long journey on this. That was, and it's coming up pretty nicely. Take it from here and make something great. And next class, we're taking a whole new shot, and we're going to concentrate on taking a matte painting that was done for us by Matthew Connor, and we'll see how we can take that basic matte painting and integrate it into a difficult environment. So see you all next week. Bye-bye.